Hello, this is just a few thoughts to share on the issue of shapeshifting in mythology and in folk tales and legends and those stories that are of a sort of slightly less dramatic order than tales of the gods and goddesses. And what we can understand by the nature of shapeshifting, what it means, how to interpret it, whether it's from an audience point of view of listening to that story or reading it or whatever method you're taking the story in by, or a teller's point of view, whether you are an oral storyteller or you're sitting at your laptop typing away and creating stories in the written word. Um, we could start with a little bit of Jungian thought, particularly a chap called Christopher Vogler, who writes from a number of different angles within the Jungian school of archetypal psychology. He is a screenwriter who works in the movie industry, and has suggested that there are 7 major archetypes that appear in film, TV, kind of modern day storytelling, if you like, which track back to ancient figures in ancient storytelling. I'm not going to go over all 7 because we simply don't have the time, but one of them is the archetype of the shapeshifter. And the way that Vogler understands this overlaps with the older, bigger archetype, if you like, of the trickster. Now, the trickster, without going too in depth into that, is a figure who sits at the liminal spaces, which is to say, where two worlds meet. He is or she is at that kind of juncture where they're not wholly in one world and not wholly in the other, but they've got a sort of foot in either camp, and is a figure that very much pushes the boundaries, tests the boundaries, sometimes like a sort of stroppy teenager testing the rules at home to see what they can get away with and what they can't get away with, but also in the sense that all societies, regardless of age groups that we might be talking about, develop rules and laws and regulations which are needed and vital for survival and development and the emotional security and containment of the people within that society, but that over time any rule can become fossilized. The more we could well argue, as did was it Plato, I think, who said that the more rules a society has, the more injustice there is in a society. The more law, the more injustice, the greater the injustice. That there's this sort of mentality, this love of bureaucracy, which was warned against by Max Weber, a German sociologist of the 19th and early 20th century, that we should be on our guard against this mindset that loves rules, rules, rules for the sake of rules. And so the trickster comes along to sporadically shake up that excess love of rules and regulations and make us question which of these rules do we still need, which are still useful to us, and which are in fact now suffocating us and weighing us down and becoming fossilized, becoming burdens rather than advantages. And so by pushing against rules, by shaking up authority, it can get complacent rulers either out of office or at least to buck their ideas up a bit and work more effectively. And it can get the rules themselves reconsidered and changed. The trickster, I don't think at any rate, is pushing for absolute anarchy, but rather is always there to test the mettle of law and order to see if it's still serving its worthwhile function, rather than falling into um, uselessness and burdensomeness. And the shapeshifter is part of that, in that, at least as far as Vogler is concerned, the shapeshifter is can be understood in the sense of like a werewolf, somebody who's one thing 1 minute and then literally changes shape and becomes a different creature entirely, but also in the sense of people with dual personalities or shifting personalities. So physically they haven't sprouted fur and fangs, they're still a human being, but someone who appears to be one thing only to be revealed as another. So someone who appears to be a friend, who later on turns out to be the villain of the piece, the one who smiles and smiles and smiles and yet can still be a villain. Or conversely, the one who appears the right miserable swine at the start of the thing, the awful, horrible, nasty, unpleasant character, who is later revealed to be the more benevolent, kindly figure, the trustworthy figure who is just a bit of an old grump or something. And so that kind of shifting of shape, that the character appears to fill one role in a story and then is later revealed to actually be fulfilling another role. And that can be understood from both the point of view of the person on the receiving end of it, as well as the person themselves who is the shapeshifter. So to be on the receiving end of that is to have your capacity for truth discernment tested. Can you see past appearances to the heart, the core of another person? So that the individual who is, I think all those fairy tales about kissing frogs and Beauty and the Beast and so on, someone on the outside who is hideous and awful there, not just to look at, but in terms of their temperament, their personality, their character, they're very, very off-putting, but who underneath it has that heart of gold. And conversely, the flip side, the person who is all glamour and charm and wonder and very seductive, but who is rotten to the core. So he's a bit of a kind of a Lucifer character there, the fallen angel that looks good on the outside but is anything but good on the inside. And there's lots of stories, both ancient mythical ones as well as more modern day ones and folk tales in the middle, that deal with those sorts of themes. And again, it's how well do you see through the surface to see what's underneath. So if you are conned, there was a TV show in Britain called Hustler, which was quite an entertaining show. Had Adrian Lester and various other actors in it. All about con men, but it was a kind of a slight Robin Hood sort of thing, in that they only conned the wicked and they didn't go around conning nice people. And the tagline of the show was that you can't con an honest person, which obviously is rubbish because you can. The sort of premise of the show was that they were exploiting the greedy, the wicked, the corrupt, sort of teaching them a bit of a lesson and wagging a finger at them. And so those people who were conned because of their own stupidity, and not just stupidity, but their own greed, their own malice, their own willingness to bend the rules to make a fast buck for themselves. And that had they been more morally upstanding characters, they would not have fallen for the con in the first place. And I suppose there is an element of that in the role of the shapeshifter. Can you see, do you have the moral mettle, the wisdom, the insight, and so forth, to see what is at the heart of another person? Or maybe even not, I was going to say another human, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a human, of course. It can be understood in other contexts, especially from a pagan point of view. We have this notion of there being a world of other beings out there aside from humans. Intelligent and sapient beings that we can communicate with. Can you see beyond the glamour to see what is underneath? And a lot of fairy tales do deal with that idea of glamour, of the working of a magic to make something appear far more attractive than in reality it actually is. And if you can't see beyond it, do you sort of deserve what you get at the end of it? Which is a bit of a harsh judgment, but that's often a theme in a lot of these sorts of stories. From the shape-shifter's point of view, the other end of the spectrum, theirs is, well, perhaps to some extent it's also about deception, but maybe more critically it's about adaptation. Because there's also a lot of stories in which the hero of the piece is able to do what they do and achieve good things because they can change guise, either in a very kind of magical sense that they turn into a different shape, or they are able to inveigle themselves into the camp of the enemy by pretending to be something. Donning a disguise in Sherlock Holmes stories, where he puts on a disguise and uses he's disguised himself as a vicar or a stable boy or whatever it is pretending to be. And that's how he gets information about the villain and solves the crime. So the ability to adapt disguises and for a period look like something else in order to infiltrate the hostile camp. So that sense of adaptability, can you change for the circumstance and become something that will advance your goals, your aims, your ambitions, which of course when it's done by the hero is always a good aim and a good ambition, and when it's done by the villain it's always for something wicked and awful. and real life example. There's all these scandals about various celebrities who had a public persona of being very charitable and giving and funny and this and that and the other, and it turns out that they're prolific sex offenders and getting up to all manner of other awful shenanigans on the quiet. Um, when it's done for malevolent purposes, then the shape-shifting is deceptive. Well, it's always deceptive in a sense, but the deception is of a more acutely negative form. But sometimes, as in the sort of more Robin Hood type scenarios, where you've got someone who is trying to advance a greater good and using deception to do it, rather challenges that whole Immanuel Kant ethic that you've got to be honest on every single occasion, no matter what, no matter the consequences, that honesty is always a necessity. Maybe from a more kind of, um, well, pagan point of view, that accepting nature for what it is. Nature has many examples of creatures that use disguises and camouflage and um, the chameleon changing colour and so on. Deception is a worthwhile evolutionary strategy. Sometimes it gets you where you need to go, which is staying alive. So it can be understood in that sort of point of view. Kind of gone off point here now. Never mind. Anyway, in terms of themes within stories, and how we can also understand the idea of the archetype of the shapeshifter and what the shapeshifter is conveying to us in tales. I would say it's not going to be the same thing in every story. You've got to understand each story in its own merits, but common themes that crop up. One, I think, is the idea of the beast within, and here I'm taking shapeshifting in its more mythical sense of a person who turns into an animal or a monster or some other thing, the full werewolf job of fur and claws and what have you, rather than the cunning con merchant who disguises themselves in a much more human way. So that full-on turning into a creature, turning into a thing. Partly it's to do, at least in a lot of stories, with the notion of the beast within. So the werewolf tales are a fairly obvious one there, of someone who turns into a ravening monster and roams the neighbourhood, eating livestock and eating other human beings. Although it always begs the question, if you're a werewolf, are you still a human being? Therefore, is it actually cannibalism if a werewolf eats a human? Are these two different species? But that's a moot point. The beast is the animal side of human nature. Freud would talk about the id, that dark, raging, impulsive self that has no conception of social niceties and social rules, or compassion or kindness or any of that, and just acts on primordial instinct. From a Jungian point of view, although Freud did also talk of the shadow, but you could talk more in that context of that dark, destructive, impulsive, hidden self that has to emerge. And so, as per the werewolf stories, although some of the older stories don't focus on the full moon to quite the extent that a lot of modern day horror films do, but at some juncture, whether it's the full moon or a different point of point in time, as with some stories, that the beast must emerge, the darkness must emerge. You cannot keep your shadow contained and hidden forever. And so the idea of somebody who's nice and kind and sweet and loving, who suddenly sprouts hair and fangs and turns into a monster, is that everyone, no matter how gentle, how kind, how compassionate, how timid, how shy, has the dark side to them. They have a darkness within them, because every single person does. And therefore, if you think of someone only as a radiant, sweet, light, lovely, smashing person, you are only ever seeing a part of them. You are not acknowledging the entirety of their being, and perhaps they are not acknowledging the entirety of their own being. And so you get the myths of someone who suddenly turns into this frightening, scary, dark creature who is at home in the forests and in the dark, who hunts by scent and who predates off others. We have to acknowledge, I think, is the theme of those types of shape-shifting stories. We have to acknowledge both that the beast within ourselves and the beast within other people. and not have a one-sided all sweetness and light view of human nature. And there's certainly an element of the beast can be understood at multiple levels. At one level, you have the notion of seemingly nice people who are capable of great wickedness, like those celebrities with the good public relations image, who turn out to be quite horrible underneath. Some people, well, as we all know from lived experience, are exactly like that. They look nice, and then suddenly you discover there's this horrific side to their nature. And so the beast within can be that extreme capacity for brutality, for cruelty, for sexual depravity, for all sorts of really, really grim things. But I think at a less extreme sense, we can see to a degree that going back in time to the 3rd century, the development of the Manichaean religion, which had this huge dichotomy between the world of spirit, which was all that was good and lovely and cerebral and wonderful in the universe, and the world of the flesh that was all wicked and sinful and depraved and debauched and beyond redemption. St. Paul, before he had become, sorry, not St. Paul, Augustine, getting my saints confused here, before he had become a Christian, had been a Manichaean. And there is a strong argument to make that even after he converted to Christianity, he probably brought a lot of his Manichaean ideas with him, and that permeated out into medieval Christianity. That contempt for the flesh, that sense that the world was a wicked, evil place of the devil, and therefore everything to do with the world, food and drink and nature and sexuality, all of those were dirty, wicked, filthy things. And so gradually there is this growing sense of disgust at the world that becomes quite dominant within Christianity. Not every branch of Christianity, not every denomination, but certainly there is that deeply hostile core within Christianity. And I think that even is found in some of the pagan myths, that some pagans felt in a not dissimilar way themselves. But also, of course, in terms of later translations of pagan myths and retellings of pagan myths, where those translations and retellings took place in the Christian era, they are influenced by that Christian overlay. We, as people brought up in the West at least, in Christian cultures, and some listeners might have been brought up in Jewish households or Islamic households or whatever before they've converted, we come to our understanding of ancient paganism through the lens of the culture we were brought up in. So we carry those sorts of overlays in our own heads, even if they weren't part of the original stories. So in that context, what I'm trying to say is that the beast isn't necessarily the kind of raving serial killer psychopath thing, but simply our more animal nature, our sensuality, by which I don't only mean sex, I mean that kind of, love of food and drink and somewhere warm and comfy to sleep and that kind of, just the sort of physicality of our nature, which for a long period of time we've had this very anti-sensual culture that has put this elevation on the cerebral and the abstractedly spiritual, and denigrated the sensual and the physical and the naturalistic as something brutish and grotty and dark. And so the idea of the shapeshifter, of someone who becomes an animal, can be understood as someone who's got this dual nature, the more cerebral human nature and the more physical animalistic nature, and the need for those to be resolved, to find a balance, that we must come to accept the beast within, that we are, when all is said and done, animals. Much as we might want to pretend we're above the animals, we're a cut above the rest of nature, well, we're not. We are animals. We're as prone to the same physicalities as animals, the same emotions and panics and concerns and worries and hopes and fears and loves and everything else that other animal species, particularly the more social animal species, are prone to. And so, even though in some stories the tale ends with the shapeshifter being killed and the beast is vanquished in that sense, but it never really goes away. And in those tales where the beast is killed at the end, there you could sort of see that as a triumph of the cerebral over the animal, the ending of the animal. Is that necessarily a good thing? I personally don't think it is. I think that's a kind of almost like a darkened ending to the tale, where instead of achieving resolution with the beast within, it's killed off. Except it's never quite killed off. It's, shall we say, shoved more deeply into the unconscious, repressed more deeply, and goes. And as Freud says, the deeper you repress it, the longer you repress it for, the more festering it becomes. So when it returns in the sequel, if we're getting into films and novels and whatnot, then it returns even more vicious than it was first time round. And so the beast can have the potential for a positive role, which overlaps with another angle I wanted to mention, that shapeshifters are often, where at least in some stories, it's not always known to the hero, because it's not the hero that's a shapeshifter, it's one of the secondary characters, the support characters in the tale. That the hero may not always realise the shapeshifter is a shapeshifter at the start. So they may come to befriend that character, thinking that they are an animal, or that they're a friendly peasant, or wise old what's it, and only later do they realise that the character is a shapeshifter and moves between different states. And so in that sense, the shapeshifter is reminiscent of the familiar, the friendly animal, the guiding animal. And a lot of stories, myths, legends, folk tales, etc., have an animal which isn't necessarily shapeshifter. They are just, say, just an animal. They retain one shape throughout the whole story, but they're a talking animal. And so that whilst they don't change shape, they are at that kind of not quite animal, not quite human, not quite one thing, not quite another liminal state. And that needs to be placed in the same category, understanding that the animal figure is not wholly one thing or another. And so from a Jungian point of view, it fits in with this idea of the benevolent animal, the helper animal, the assistant animal, like the witch's familiar, or the wizard's familiar for that matter. And so the shape-shifter is sometimes a benevolent figure. It's not always the ravening werewolf. Sometimes it's a more kindly figure who enters into the story to aid the main hero or heroine of the tale, and uses the fact that they can walk between worlds. That's rather like Puss in Boots. At one moment they're just a cat, and at another moment they're the cleverest figure in the story. And they're using their wisdom and their insight to guide the hero where they need to go, and to challenge the monsters and come up with solutions to all the trials in the hero's life. So understanding that if you take the Jungian view, that all of these characters in the story are different aspects of the same person. They're not different people. They are just different parts, different moving parts, different organs within the same body. The hero is the sort of the ego, the sense of self journeying through life. The helpful animal, the talking animal, is therefore the instinctual side, the animalistic side, but the side that's the part of the person that's in tune with their animal nature. So again, we're going to this sort of slightly Manchain thing, that the natural self, rather than being a threat or a villain or a monster that has to be vanquished and driven away with silver bullets or whatever else, is actually a source of wisdom, a source of intuition, a source of understanding and insight into the world. And if you listen to that instinctual voice within, that primal animal voice, it will guide you in life. And so it becomes a positive self rather than a sort of monstrous, terrifying self. And it's the bright side rather than the shadow side of the archetype, and that linking into the sense, the naturalistic sense of who we are, and the natural sense of self. Taking a more pagan point of view than, I mean, Jung, as far as we know, wasn't a full-on pagan, although he was deeply interested in the mythology, but from a slightly removed point of view. We can look at a lot of stories, but I think a lot of Irish stories here, Welsh stories, where characters go through multiple cycles of changing shapes. They don't just change shape once, they change shape into all sorts of different things over the course of the story. And Tuan Machariel, for example, in Irish myth, and Fintan also goes through multiple shapes. Those sorts of stories can be understood in a variety of different ways. Um, One point as a suggestion can be the idea that it's sort of like reincarnation, but without needing to completely die in the course of the story. And it reflects down into modern literature like T.H. White's The Once and Future King, where Merlin teaches the very young Arthur, before he becomes king, to shapeshift into different guises, an ant and a goose and all sorts of other things. And in each shape he learns a lesson, which you could say is sort of the point of reincarnation, and it's understood that you have a life in a body, you learn a set of lessons in that body, and then you die and you become something else, and you learn a different set of lessons. And the things that one incarnation, one body can teach you are different from the things that a different type of incarnation, a different body can teach. And so these stories of shapeshifting, of people becoming lots of different things, it's a bit like the idea that they are moving through a series of reincarnations. One day they're a salmon, one day they're a wild boar, one day they're a stag. Each day is a lifetime as that being, that creature. And understanding that, um, as per the Hindu tales, that there are lessons to learn in each phase, in each aspect, lessons to acquire that you would not get. The things you can learn as a dog, you could never learn as a horse, and the things you can learn as a horse, you could never learn as a human, and things you can learn as a human, you could never learn as a parrot. And you have to be the thing in order to learn the lessons of the shape. And lots of traditions around the world have techniques, shamanic style techniques, whether with the use of entheogen plants and mushrooms, or dance or drumming or chanting, or 101 different other techniques to induce a trance state. And in the trance state, the person experiences shapeshifting. So whilst their body is just lying on the floor, their body doesn't sprout wings or fur and fangs, but their mind undergoes this shapeshifting experience where they feel themselves to be another animal, another type of being, and they move through that experience, and at the end of it, whether it lasts 10 minutes or an hour or however long it may last, they emerge from that state having learned something that they didn't know before, having become a wiser, hopefully better, hopefully more rounded person. They are adding to and deepening their humanity from this shape-shifting experience. Sometimes it's done for purely practical reasons, that the person shapeshifts into a bird and they engage in what nowadays is often referred to as fast seeing, that they fly 100 miles away and see something going on in the land of a rival tribe or whatever it might be, and then they report back to their own tribe what they've seen. So not necessarily a profound mystical spiritual revelation, but a useful technique nonetheless. And that is an idea permeated a lot of the witch trial accounts of someone who, for example, various stories about somebody who shoots at a hare, wounds the hare in the field, and then they follow the trail of blood back to the cottage of the peculiar old lady who lives on the edge of the village. When they burst into the poor old woman's cottage, there she is in bed, looking half dead, with a wound in the same part of her body as the hare was wounded in this argument that having been injured in one shape, the injury manifests, continues on when the person reverts to their original shape, which can be understood simply as a metaphor, of course, or it can be viewed the idea that if she was in bed in this trance state and projecting her consciousness as an astral body phenomena, that maybe the hunter in the field with a gun was able, gifted enough, to see that manifestation, and having injured the manifestation, it ricochets back onto the person who has projected that astral presence, whatever you want to call it, in the first place. So that can be understood at a multiple number of levels as to how this is sort of playing out. We can understand the same thing in terms of how we view the stories of our gods and goddesses, of the myths and legends of all sorts of beings in all Celtic myths, Norse myths, Native American myths, African myths, East Asian myths and stories, Greek, Roman, you name it, practically every culture on earth has stories of beings who can change shape, who can become something else. Some of those beings are gods and goddesses, or they're dragons, or some other kind of amazing magical being. And sometimes these skills are taught to humans, who become able to participate in this process of moving through phases and becoming different beings, and experiencing different aspects of self. There are other ways to understand these stories. It doesn't have to be taken in the way I've just presented. So you could, for example, going back to the case of Tuan Mackerel and Fintan in Irish myths, see this as not so much one person shape-shifting into these different forms, and each form is their lifetime, but because they stay in one form for very, very, very long periods of time, much longer than any human could live, or salmon, or deer, or whatever, that maybe these shapes represent eras of time. So the age of the salmon, the age of the hawk, these are ways of conceptualizing time, and would have been understood perhaps by the tribes who first told these stories, that when Fintan becomes a hawk, it represents that 1,000-year period of time, and when he becomes a salmon, it represents another 1,000 years period of time, something in that vein. So it could have been a way of measuring time, just as we have, in astrology, so it's the we're in the month of the ram, or the month of the bull, or the month of the scorpion, or whatever. So we have this sort of imagery to represent time through different animal shapes. Something like that may have been going on in subcultures, perhaps, but we've lost some of the original context. But the two arguments are not mutually exclusive. It could represent a period of time, but also have an element in which we're understanding that someone is undergoing a change of consciousness and a change of understanding their views of the world, a change of their grasp of reality. In talking of shape-shifting, what I'm mostly thinking of are beings who have some degree of control over their own process and go back and forth between different shapes, rather than people who are permanently changed into one shape. So you've got stories like Arachne in Greek myth, who's turned into a spider for her hubris about claiming to be a better weaver than Athena. So she is shape-shifting, but it's in a very permanent basis. She is stuck as a spider forevermore. She can't go back to being a human, or chop and change between the two. And I think that is representative of something different, metaphorically, psychologically, spiritually, than beings who are capable of altering either at will or on a cyclical basis, where they become this thing for a while, and then they become another thing, and then they become another thing. So they're going through different shapes. I think there is a subtle difference in those stories as to what they represent and how they're to be understood. But that kind of brings me mostly to the end of what I wanted to say in terms of exploring these ideas and how you can understand the meaning of stories. So you could take an example of a story where, let's say, Loki turns into a horse in order to lure away the magical horse that a giant is using to build a wall with, which he does that in order to disrupt the bet which that giant has with the gods, or the gods of Asgard. So he wins the bet of the gods of Asgard by luring this magical horse away, and the giant can't fulfill the promise he's made to build the wall within a certain time zone. You could understand that story as just Loki being a trickster character and coming up with a cunning way of getting done what he wants done, even if that means he has to not only change species but change sex in order to flutter his horsey eyelids at the stallion and lure the stallion away for a bit of rumpy-bumpy, and it ends up with Sleipnir being born as a result of this. So Loki becomes a mother. Is it a representation just of his willingness to do anything it takes to get what he wants, no matter how extreme, becoming different species, getting pregnant, doing all sorts of stuff that most people would not want to do just to win a bet. Is it simply a representation of a sort of a ruthlessness? Or is the horse a metaphor for something that he adapts a state of mind, a sort of equine presence? And it is the equine state of mind that is needed to achieve what Loki sets out to achieve, is required of him to be capable of this way of thinking, this way of understanding. There's all sorts of ways in which you could interpret and understand that story, and just rather than telling you the view I take, just to raise these sort of ideas and speculations as to how you might want to apply theory, apply notion and concept to understanding these stories, so that you could just see them as entertainment and have a bit of a laugh at the story and leave it at that, or you could read in for deeper meaning, deeper significance. Is this a link between that being which we call Loki and the consciousness of horses as an entire species, and how that entity we call Loki interacts with horse species? There was the element in Gulliver's Travels where it was argued that if horses could worship deity, or had a notion of a deity, they would look like a horse, which was meant to be a satire on why do humans envisage God as being an old man with a big white beard on a cloud, that each species would see the divine in their own image, which may well be the case, but also brings to the fore the possibility that humans are not the only beings that have divine experiences. I certainly don't think they are. I think a range of species have experience of something beyond the humdrum and the everyday, something transcendental. And so maybe there are entities that straddle more than one species. Yes, they communicate with humans, but they also communicate with other things too. And maybe these tales of shapeshifting are ways of indicating in metaphorical fashion that this being crosses more than one species bridge, that they are participating in different species at the same time, and the lived consciousness. So there is a human consciousness, Jung calls that collective unconscious, but is there equally a collective horse unconscious, a collective dog unconscious, a collective sparrow unconscious, in which maybe humans can sometimes cross the bridge, a bit of sort of shamanic work between species, but also that there are certain entities that move between the collective thought processes of different species. I think that is possible, and that's of course another way of interpreting these tales of shapeshifting. It's a way of telling to the listener, this deity connects to more than just us, connects to these other species that it has taken the shape of. And I do appreciate there are also stories in which beings take the shape of tables and chairs and things that are not just a variety of animals, but maybe they are a different order of stories and addressing different issues than the tales about beings who can become various animals, or that kind of half and half state like the werewolf, where it's not quite a wolf and it's not quite a human, it's a midway state between the two. But I'll leave it here, and if anyone's got any questions or comments or suggestions, you can always type them into the comment box, and I will make a point of trying to read the comments and respond to them. How we can take it from there. Thank you.